I know where I stand, I know where this party stands, and that's in the national interest.
Him and his Chancellor are trying to divide the country.
I'm impatient for reform.
A new range of measures that will further pile on the agony.
Politics is not about agreeing on everything. It's something of huge importance to the Scottish people.
His party would sell Welsh businesses down the river.
Let's hear it! Let's hear it!
Real drama, live and uncut on BBC Parliament.
What will everyone be talking about tomorrow?
With BBC News, you don't need to wait to find out.
We'll tell you which stories are making the front pages.
And explore the stories behind the headlines.
That's The Papers with me, Clive Myrie.
Or me, Martine Croxall, and our panel of expert guests.
Every night after the news at 10 on the BBC News Channel.
Hello, you're with BBC World News. I'm Sally Bundock. Here are the top stories this hour. A US intelligence report suggests North Korea may have developed nuclear warheads small enough to put on ballistic missiles. The US Secretary of State John Kerry will arrive in Seoul shortly for talks on the crisis in the Korean peninsula. G8 foreign ministers have pledged $35 million to stamp out rape in war-torn countries. The money will be used to document incidents and to fund legal assistance for victims, as well as training peacekeepers to respond to sexual violence. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have turned out for final campaign rallies ahead of Sunday's election. The acting president, Nicolas Maduro, will take on opposition candidate Enrique Capriles to succeed President Hugo Chavez, who died last month. The US Senate has voted to debate new gun restrictions for the first time in 20 years, but the watered-down proposals, which include background checks on commercial gun purchases, are still likely to face tough opposition in both houses of Congress. Those are the latest headlines from BBC World News. Now let's bring you right up to date with the financial news. It's over to Alice.
Europe's finance chiefs meet in Dublin later. Top of the agenda, the ballooning cost of Cyprus's bailout. And will Slovenia be next? Plus, still too risky and still too big to fail. Wall Street's giant banks are making money again, but critics say little has been done to stop another crisis. Hello and a very warm welcome to World Business Report with me, Alice Baxter. Now, in just a minute, we'll go to Singapore, where the economy has unexpectedly gone into reverse. But first this hour, Europe's 27 finance ministers gather in Dublin later for a two-day summit set to be dominated by the increasingly messy bailout of Cyprus and whether Slovenia could be next to need a rescue. Well, a draft document by international lenders leaked to the press on Thursday shows that because of its worsening financial position, the cost of bailing out Cyprus has ballooned by a third since the deal was done last month to some 23 billion euros. And that means that Cyprus now has to find another 13 billion euros. And that's almost double the 7 billion it had agreed to during the negotiations only last month. And that's likely to mean heavier losses for bank depositors. Well, ministers are also concerned that Germany's losing its appetite for funding a never-ending series of bank rescues. Here's our Europe business correspondent, Nigel Cassidy.
The 27 finance ministers of Europe are going to need all the inspiration their Dublin hosts can muster during their term in the EU presidency. Not only is the latest bailout in Cyprus seemingly billions short, but the move to place some of the burden on private depositors in failing banks has raised suspicions that Germany may not be prepared to keep financing these southern European bank bailouts. Now, privately, ministers may agree with those who say that the Cyprus rescue was botched. So high up the agenda may be ensuring that future bank rescues, perhaps Slovenia's, will be tidier. Next comes banking union, essentially dealing with bad banks. And another big issue may be whether any bailout countries should be cut any more slack, notably Portugal, after a recent court decision. Earlier, the Spanish Prime Minister gave some clue as to where the discussions may lead.
In Europe, we need to think about whether the European Central Bank should have the same functions and powers as other central banks in the world. This is one of the subjects we have to talk about, just as we will have to talk about the fiscal union and the banking union.
But this economist says no EU institution can prop up the euro if Germany decides it would no longer pick up the bills.
What I want to see, and I suspect an awful lot of other people want to see, is that they are really, really committed to building those institutions. In other words, banking union with all that it entails, and of course regular, consistent, sustainable fiscal flows from the rich north to the less well-endowed south. Otherwise, this thing is not going to hold together. There are so many questions now about its very sustainability.
For Ireland, like Portugal, winning more time to repay EU loans would help, but it's the source of future bank rescue cash that's now a major concern for the finance ministers. Nigel Cassidy, BBC News.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this now with David Jones, Chief Market Strategist at IG Index. David, how can the cost of the Cypriot bailout have jumped by about a third in less than a month? It's a pretty staggering miscalculation, isn't it?
It is a massive leap, and the politicians are blaming the previous politicians who are dealing with the crisis. I think it's probably shouldn't be something of a surprise, I think, to those of us who have seen how the Greek crisis developed over the months and the years. These problems always seem to be bigger than we first initially expect them. But for a country, of course, like all these countries that are have a real crippling economy at the moment, it's not something they want to hear.
Perhaps a certain massaging of the figures that when the news first broke, perhaps. But also, I suppose the next question is, how on earth is Cyprus going to raise this extra $6 billion? One idea on the table is that they might sell off some of their gold reserves.
That was definitely, I think, a story that was circulating a couple of days ago, and it has been, I think, confirmed as one of the options. We saw the price of gold back on Wednesday pushed down, I think, in afternoon trading in London. But I think we're going to see probably that those with more than €100,000 on deposit again are going to be the ones who are going to be looking to make up a significant chunk of this shortfall. It's still not clear as to what sort of haircuts they're going to take, but I think they're going to come under pressure once again here.
And still so many questions linger about this. Is this going to be a template for future bailouts, raiding depositors, personal funds, and will Slovenia be next in the firing line?
I think those are both very valid concerns, and I think that the action that we've seen taken on those people with significant amounts of money in savings, if I was, for example, a Slovenian saver or even an Italian or a Spanish saver, you'd think, well, actually, do I want to have my money potentially at risk here? Even though it's been said this definitely isn't a template, we don't know where we may be 6 to 12 months down the line if someone else needs a bailout.
We'll have to wait and see, won't we? David Jones from IG Index, many thanks. Now, JP Morgan Chase is the first of the Wall Street giants to report quarterly results later, followed by the likes of Goldman Sachs and Citigroup early next week. America's biggest banks are making big money again. But as Samir Hussein reports from New York, the questions remain about their safety and whether they're just too large for their own good.
It was the centerpiece of President Barack Obama's first term. But 3 years since the so-called Dodd-Frank became law, no meaningful financial regulations have been implemented.
Americans are still suffering the effects of the financial crisis. People in this country are frustrated. Banks have never really been held accountable for their failings. And today, the same question still remains. Are U.S. banks too big to fail?
Weighing into the debate, the head of the International Monetary Fund.
The priority must be to continue to clean up the banking system by recapitalizing it, restructuring it, or where necessary, sizing it down by shutting down some banks.
Smaller banks is the outcome some U.S. lawmakers are hoping for by crafting a bill that forces financial institutions to hold more capital. It's an idea that's gaining support from both sides in a normally very divided Congress. Although bankers are dismissive, there's a suggestion it would actually be in their best interest to be broken up.
The idea would be that if you sort of separated out all the parts of JP Morgan Chase & Co., they would be worth more added up together than in fact they are as an integrated unit. Now, the banks themselves clearly disagree with this. They maintain that there is a great advantage from both scale and also from sort of the overall breadth that they have, which allows for diversification.
But some argue being too big isn't the problem. It's being too secretive. The 5 largest banks have trillions of dollars in trading and derivatives that are not on their balance sheets.
The issue is one of transparency and the fact that these organizations are opaque and not revealing essentially this gigantic gambling casino in which they are currently engaged.
Engaging in risky, complex trades cost J.P. Morgan over $6 billion back in May. Confounding critics, America's largest bank survived the London whale debacle largely unscathed, suggesting its sheer size allowed it to weather that storm. Samir Hussain, BBC News, New York.
Well, let's cross over to Singapore now, where there's been a bit of worrying news about the state of the economy there. Marika Oy is in our bureau. Marika, what more do you have for us?
Well, Alice, surprising to many economists, Singapore's economy actually shrunk between January and March, almost 1.5% from the previous quarter. Many economists were expecting a modest growth, and today's data show that the manufacturing sector has been hit very hard, which goes to show that Singapore's economy, which relies heavily on exporting its products and services to the rest of the world for its growth, has been affected, of course, by Europe's debt crisis because the European Union is still one of the largest trading partners for the city-state. And of course, China is also another big trading partner. And as we've been reporting, growth there has been slowing. But the government has kept its forecast for this year, growth of 1 to 3%. So the authorities seem confident that growth will come back.
OK, Marika, many thanks for that. Marika Oy there for us in Singapore. Let's have a quick look at markets now. And in Asia, shares have retreated marginally after some recent gains, with investors, of course, keeping a very wary eye on developments on the Korean Peninsula. But confidence being underpinned by Wall Street's record high close overnight, while the yen remains weak there at the bottom of your screen. The dollar nearing 100 yen, a level unseen for 4 years now. That's all from me. Back in the next hour.
Our thanks to Alice. She'll return in a moment when we look through today's papers. But first, let's focus on a bit of UK news. Web and phone games aimed at children that charge for extras are being investigated by the Office of Fair Trading. The OFT wants to find out if the games are putting undue pressure on children to pay for additional content. And it's written to companies who offer such games, asking them for information on how they market to children.
Last month, 5-year-old Danny Kitchen from Bristol spent £1,700 on iTunes without his parents realising. He was playing on the family's iPad and asked his dad to put in a passcode so he could download a free game. But he unwittingly bought extra add-ons, running up the alarming bill.
He put the password in and then the next day it costed the money.
Luckily, the Kitchen family got a refund, but their story isn't unique. Many other parents have also had costly surprises. Now the Office of Fair Trading's going to investigate if games that are initially free to access put unfair pressure on children to buy more features, including new levels or virtual currencies such as fruit or coins. They're writing to companies that provide free games on the internet about their marketing to children and asking parents and consumer groups for examples of potentially misleading or commercially aggressive practices, which may break consumer protection laws.
We don't have the power to ban games, but what we will be looking to do is to make sure that games companies are complying with the law. We hope we may come out with some standards that the industry might sign up to, but it's early days yet. We want to talk to them about what the issues are.
The OFT will publish their findings in the autumn. Emily Junior, BBC News.
And there'll be more on that story and all the other leading news, business and some sport in Breakfast. That's in about 15 minutes with John Kay and Louise Minchin. Hello again, I'm Sally Bundock with you on BBC World News. Let's update you on the top stories this hour. A US intelligence report suggests North Korea may have developed nuclear warheads small enough to put on ballistic missiles. The US Secretary of State John Kerry will arrive in Seoul shortly for talks on the crisis in the Korean Peninsula. G8 foreign ministers have pledged $35 million to stamp out rape in war-torn countries. The money will be used to document incidents and to fund legal assistance for victims, as well as training peacekeepers to respond to sexual violence. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have turned out for final campaign rallies ahead of Sunday's elections. The acting president Nicolas Maduro will take on opposition candidate Enrique Capriles to succeed President Hugo Chavez, who died last month. The US Senate's voted to debate new gun restrictions for the first time in 20 years, but the watered-down proposals, which include background checks on commercial gun purchases, are still likely to face tough opposition in both houses of Congress. Now let's look through some of the stories in today's papers. We've mentioned a few of them already in our programme, but if we start with The Telegraph, it looks at in the aftermath of Margaret Thatcher's death, this paper questions whether the BBC should give the Wizard of Oz song Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead radio airtime. Anti-Thatcher campaigners have encouraged the purchase of the song, which has seen it rise up in the music charts. We'll explain further in a moment.
And The Times reports on the worldwide recall of 3.4 million Toyota, Honda, Nissan and Mazda cars due to faulty airbags. The bird flu outbreak in China has been an effective antidote to food price inflation, according to today's South China Morning Post. The virus has killed 10 people. And the International Herald Tribune asks if NATO's becoming increasingly irrelevant. It quotes concerns amongst European and American officials as war in Afghanistan nears an end and European powers spend less on defence. Could parents soon be spared the shock of an unexpectedly high phone bill run up by their children? This is a story we've just been talking about. It is in today's Financial Times as well, looking at the fact that Britain's consumer protection authorities are looking to crack down on the free video game app with hidden costs. And was it all a PR stunt? Asked The Independent of David Beckham's decision to give all of his wages from Paris Saint-Germain to good causes. Local charities say they've yet to receive a penny. PSG say they're considering various options. We haven't had comment from him on that yet, have we? Well, we have got David Jones here, though, Chief Market Strategist with IG Index, to comment on all of these stories. Good morning, David. Nice to see you. So this story, Daily Telegraph front page, BBC Chief refuses to ban Thatcher death song. And just to explain to our viewers overseas, who may not understand what this is all about, here in the UK we have the music charts, and on a Sunday the top 10, at least the top 10, if not the top 20, I can't remember now.
It's top 40.
Oh, top 40, there you go. It's been a while since I listened to it. They're played on Radio 1, and among the top 40 at the moment is the song Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead, which of course is from the film The Wizard of Oz. And the question is, should the BBC play it on Sunday morning or not? On Wednesday, it's Margaret Thatcher's funeral.
I think the quick answer is it's not down to the BBC to censor this sort of thing. I think regardless of what you think of this, what people are saying is an anti-Margaret Thatcher stunt, I do think it is pretty distasteful, but it's not the BBC's job to sit there and censor this. During the 80s, for example, when Mrs Thatcher was in power, there were plenty of anti-government songs, and it wasn't the BBC's job then to decide what we couldn't listen to. They have banned songs in the past because they deem the offensive their content offensive to maybe people who are slightly younger age, but I do struggle to see the criticism of the BBC here.
Now, ultimately, the decision will be made by the Radio 1 controller, which is Ben Cooper. But this article is saying, and many close friends of Margaret Thatcher have said that the new Director General, Mr Tony Hall, should
new Director General.
He's been in the job just over a week. He should make a decision about this, and it just goes to show. In fact, the article is quite strong. It says that he will be guilty, this new Director General, of serious dereliction of duty if he allows the song to be played out. It just reminds us all how difficult a job it is, doesn't it?
It's incredibly difficult, and of course we know that the BBC has been under a lot of scrutiny in recent months. He's new in the job. It is an enormous amount of pressure on him, but also many of Mrs Thatcher's friends and supporters said actually she would have said, letting them play it. You know, it's the whole principle of free speech. We know the part that the government back then played in breaking down the Iron Curtain. And I think she'd say, well, at least it shows that they're still maybe bothered by what I did. It still had an impact. So I do think the criticism of the BBC is somewhat unfair.
We'll see what happens on Sunday.
Yeah, it's a deeply sensitive issue, particularly here in the UK, isn't it? Moving on, though, to The Times, reporting on this worldwide recall of some 3.4 million Toyota, Honda, Nissan and Mazda cars due to these faulty airbags. And this is the third major recall that Toyota's had to undergo in as much as in the past 3 years, isn't it? It's not a great track record.
No, it's not. It's really bad PR, unfortunately, for Toyota. But then again, they are, one of the world's largest car manufacturers in terms of the volume they ship.
It's not just Toyota.
No, that's true. That's true. It's the other,
it's
the other Japanese manufacturers as well. And it's down to, I think, an oversight in a Mexican plant, which is the second biggest plant in the world for manufacturing these, where these airbags weren't tested. They do stress, and I think it's a very fair point. We haven't seen any incidents in the UK yet. Some of these cars are 13 years old. There are hundreds of thousands of these cars on the roads around the world.
Points out how many are in Britain, doesn't it?
Yes.
150,000 British drivers could be behind the wheel of one of these cars. But I mean, it's a global issue.
It is, and I think it's clearly it is a big story. But I think in this day and age, because cars now have so much more technology, so much more safety features than they did 15 years ago, 20 years ago, recalls like this are just a part and parcel, I think, of modern cars.
And they're not uncommon, are they, recalls?
No, absolutely not. All manufacturers have them, but it's the high-profile ones where you have potentially an airbag exploding that clearly
it's
the press...
passenger airbag,
exactly.
apparently. Yeah. Now, let's move on. South China Morning Post. Obviously, there's a new outbreak, a new strain of bird flu there, H7N9. And so far, 10 people have died as a consequence. Now, this article in the business section looks at bird flu seen as a curb on inflation, because in China, food prices represent 30% of the weighting when they measure inflation, and it was lower than expected this week. Funny bit of a take, but it is a relevant take, isn't it?
I think it is. It's an economic take on the impact that this outbreak has had. And as you say, food inflation is a problem around the world, full stop, for the last few years. The increasing price of food.
It's a very important problem in China, though, isn't it?
That's very true.
When food prices go up, millions, if not billions, are in difficult situations.
And we saw a big drop last month, as you say. They were expecting a 3.6% rise. It ended up being 2.7% because people are shunning chicken and pork.
KFC also saying that its sales have slumped there as well. You're right, it is an interesting take on the story. Moving on, the International Herald Tribune. NATO potentially becoming increasingly irrelevant because European powers in this day of austerity unwilling to spend money on defence.
I think it's a really interesting story, this one. It's a really interesting take on it, on the whole Europe, an effect of the European crisis, where an easy place to make cuts, if you're a European country, is cut back on defence. A lot of the threats in recent years have gone. If we wound the clock back 40 years, we did have all of the Eastern Bloc countries. We had the Cold War ongoing, worries that maybe something would happen there. So that did really validate the case for NATO, everyone bonding together. And the US are saying, I think quite rightly, the Europeans, and including us as well, the UK in that, we're maybe not playing our part, and particularly when it comes to financial contributions here, we're relying too much on the USA. Maybe NATO does need an overhaul. We do need to look at how we can all work together.
It's funny, actually, because when I read this article, I was reminded of, not so long ago, the IMF. And everybody was looking at the IMF and saying, hang on a second, is this relevant anymore? People aren't putting money in the pot anymore. Do we need it? We need to overhaul it. We need to change it. And now the IMF's right in the thick of everything, isn't it?
It's a very fair point. And of course
NATO obviously is pulling out of Afghanistan. There's a lot of questions about its role now and the future. And it's interesting how things change.
Yeah.
They do move on. Now, Financial Times is looking at a story that we've focused on quite a bit already on the BBC. This move by the Office of Fair Trading in the UK to look at these games and the fact that children, without realising it, can spend an awful lot of money buying whatever they need in order to play a game. And we had this example of this young boy who spent thousands without realising, and the parents obviously had a big shock.
Yeah.
Give us your take. Do you think it's the role of the OFT to get involved here?
there's no harm in maybe putting these games under a bit more scrutiny. I'm sure plenty of us have been affected by this. I've been affected by it by the tune of maybe a couple of pounds, where you palm your child off for a few minutes with a game. They sit there and basically something pops up in the game. Do you want to buy more lives? Do you want to buy whatever it is?
I mean, it's very easy.
And you just click of course,
on allow or don't allow. It's kind of,
And if you've done it and you set it all up with your password so it remembers, then it will go through and buy these things for you. And there have been some shocking examples of people who've had unexpected bills of thousands of pounds. So yes, we should look at them. But also, I also think, as parents, we have to take a bit of interest in what's going on and keep an eye on what our children are doing and make sure we warn them that this can happen.
I just find it staggering as the non-parent here that kids can just, 5-year-olds can rack up thousands of pounds.
You wait till you become a parent.
Oh,
don't.
You'll understand. This final story, though, very quickly in The Independent, David Beckham, this big hoo-ha that he was going to give his wages from Paris Saint-Germain to charity. It's not happened yet.
No, it hasn't. It's been.
Where's the money, David?
He's been 10 weeks into the job. He gets paid allegedly €200,000 a week. He said, we're going to give all this money to charity, children's charities. They haven't done it yet. I'm sure it is just an oversight by Paris Saint-Germain, the football club. They may have been inundated with requests. They may be filing through them. But this story, I think it's good that this story has come out to put some pressure on them, to remind them, look, you did say this. It's 2.5 months ago now. Can we get it moving?
All right. Well, David, thank you so much for your time. David Jones from IG Index. And thank you for your company too. Stay with us. We'll see you soon.
Of your life. Keep it with you.
Only the best play in the Masters. Full tournaments on Radio 5 Live. Live TV coverage tomorrow at 7:30 on BBC Two.
I know where I stand, I know where this party stands, and that's in the national interest.
Him and his Chancellor are trying to divide the country. I'm impatient for reform.
A new range of measures that will further pile on the agony.
Politics is not about agreeing on everything. It's something of huge importance to the Scottish people.
His party would sell Welsh businesses down the river.
Let's hear it! Let's hear it!
Real drama, live and uncut on BBC Parliament.
And the two Red Bull teammates go at it.
This is silly, Seb, come on.
You can't engineer the passion. The Formula One season continues across the BBC with full live coverage of the Chinese Grand Prix. Qualifying starts Saturday from 6 a.m. on BBC One and Radio 5 Live.
If you need to know, now. If you're asking, what's next? If the latest is vital. If you have to follow every development. If you want every headline, anytime. If the story matters wherever you are. If the news is part of your life. keep it with you.
Only the best play in the Masters. Full tournaments on Radio 5 Live. Live TV coverage tomorrow at 7:30 on BBC Two.
I know where I stand, I know where this party stands, and that's in the national interest.
Him and his chancellor are trying to divide the country. I'm impatient for reform.
A new range of measures that will further pile on the agony.
Politics is not about agreeing on everything. It's something of huge importance to the Scottish people.
Me, Martine Croxall, and our panel of expert guests.
Every night after the news at 10 on the BBC News Channel.
Hello, you're with BBC World News. I'm Sally Bundock. Here are the top stories this hour. A US intelligence report suggests North Korea may have developed nuclear warheads small enough to put on ballistic missiles. The US Secretary of State John Kerry will arrive in Seoul shortly for talks on the crisis in the Korean peninsula. G8 foreign ministers have pledged $35 million to stamp out rape in war-torn countries. The money will be used to document incidents and to fund legal assistance for victims, as well as training peacekeepers to respond to sexual violence. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have turned out for final...
Well, a draft document by international lenders leaked to the press on Thursday shows that because of its worsening financial position, the cost of bailing out Cyprus has ballooned by a third since the deal was done last month to some 23 billion euros. And that means that Cyprus now has to find another 13 billion euros. And that's almost double the 7 billion it had agreed to during the negotiations only last month. And that's likely to mean heavier losses for bank depositors. Well, ministers are also concerned that Germany's losing its appetite for funding a never-ending series of bank rescues. Here's our Europe business correspondent, Nigel Cassidy.
The 27 finance ministers of Europe are going to need all the inspiration their Dublin hosts can muster during their term in the EU presidency. Not only is the latest bailout...
Campaign rallies ahead of Sunday's election. The acting president, Nicolas Maduro, will take on opposition candidate Enrique Capriles to succeed President Hugo Chavez, who died last month. The US Senate has voted to debate new gun restrictions for the first time in 20 years, but the watered-down proposals, which include background checks on commercial gun purchases, are still likely to face tough opposition in both houses of Congress. Those are the latest headlines from BBC World News. Now let's bring you right up to date with the financial news. It's over to Alice.
Europe's final...
I know where I stand, I know where this party stands, and that's in the national interest.
Him and his chancellor are trying to divide the country. I'm impatient for reform.
A new range of measures that will further pile on the agony.
Politics is not about agreeing on everything. It's something of huge importance to the Scottish people.
His party would sell Welsh businesses down the river.
Let's hear it! Let's hear it!
Real drama, live and uncut on BBC Parliament.
What will everyone be talking about tomorrow?
With BBC News, you don't need to wait to find out.
We'll tell you which stories are making the front pages.
And explore the stories behind the headlines.
That's The Papers with me, Clive Myrie.
Finance chiefs meet in Dublin later. Top of the agenda, the ballooning cost of Cyprus's bailout. And will Slovenia be next? Plus, still too risky and still too big to fail. Wall Street's giant banks are making money again, but critics say little has been done to stop another crisis. Hello and a very warm welcome to World Business Report with me, Alice Baxter. Now, in just a minute, we'll go to Singapore, where the economy has unexpectedly gone into reverse. But first this hour, Europe's 27 finance ministers gather in Dublin later for a two-day summit set to be dominated by the increasingly messy bailout of Cyprus and whether Slovenia could be next to need a rescue.